Hello, and welcome to Module 9, the first lesson in it. I want to, first of all, before we get too far into this lesson, I want to kind of bring up here as your, if you were to, click on the main module here. If you look before, you're already in the module lesson, so if you kind of scan down the page, and you get down here and you've clicked and you see this video here in the module lessons. But if you look right above it, this is something you should print out. It says logic rules. You should print this out before you begin, because it will pull up a series of rules that you will need to use in order to do the problems. And there are 18 rules. The first 8 are the rules of inference, and the second 10 are what we call rules of replacement. And rules of inference are basically they are rules that allow you to follow the process of reasoning. Rules of replacement are simply rules that say this means the same thing as that, and so it helps you unpack the meaning of words. And this basically, all these 18 rules allow you to follow the reasoning process. These are the rules that allow you to take statements like, John and Bill will be here. If John's here, then Sue will be here. Therefore, Sue must be here. That it allows you to unpack that. Because you know that if John and Bill are here, then John is here. And I already said if John is here, then Sue is here. Therefore, Sue must be here because John is here. Now, what we have is we have the rules of inference. And so let's just look at some of these rules. One of the first things to keep in mind is that, I have this bar here, or this line beneath the P and Q and the P and Q here. That line basically is just a way of signaling therefore. If this statement is true, then therefore this statement must be true. If these two statements are true, therefore the statement below it must be true. Sometimes the book will use this sort of 3-dot thing. Some of the lessons will use this 3-dot thing. That means the same thing as therefore, but I personally, for most of the problems that are on all the worksheets and everything that I'm giving you, will simply use that line. Now, the first one is what we call simplification. And simplification is just the idea that if you have two statements, a conjunctive statement, and both the conjuncts, in order for that statement to be true, must be true. So we know that any one of the conjuncts is true. So if I say something like, it's a true statement that Paul and Quentin are coming, then I can simply simplify out that Paul is coming. If I say Paul and Quentin are coming, I can simply simplify out that Quentin is coming. And this is pretty simple, because if somebody says, it's not a really very deep rule or anything. It's a pretty simple rule. Most of us know this. But it's basically just illustrating the fact that just because two statements are combined in an and doesn't mean that they're both true. As an example, if somebody says, he's handsome and tall, well, then we know he's handsome. We also know that he is tall. We don't have to keep those two descriptors together in order. If we know that he is handsome and tall, then we know he is handsome. If we know he is handsome and tall, we know he is tall. We don't have to keep it together. We can break it apart. Modus ponens is basically the idea that if you have an if-then statement, if P, then Q, if you also know that the antecedent is true, then you know the consequent is true. So if this one says, like, if Paul is coming, then Quentin is coming. Paul is coming, therefore Quentin is coming. This is basically saying that because you know the antecedent is true, the consequent must be true, and it allows us to reach that. Modus tollens, on the other hand, is taking this idea, if Paul is there, then Quentin is there. If Quentin is not there, Paul can't be there. Why can't he be there? Because if Paul was there, then Quentin would be there, but Quentin's not there. Therefore, Paul must not be there. And we can take all kinds of examples of this, but basically anytime you deny the consequent, you can then deny the antecedent. Anytime you affirm the antecedent, you can then affirm the consequent. And so that's one way to basically break apart a modus ponens statement, is to be able to know that if P, then Q, that if the antecedent is true, then the consequent is true. Now, I want to just sort of caution you. I think we've probably talked a little bit about this before, but there is a fallacy called a formal fallacy called affirming the consequent. Just because the consequence is true doesn't make the antecedent true. Because if you had something like if George Washington was assassinated, then he is dead, and then you tried to affirm the consequent, well, George Washington is dead, therefore he must not have been assassinated. Well, that's not true. Him being dead doesn't make the antecedent true, but the antecedent being true does make the consequent true. And the same thing can be done here if you had something like if Abraham Lincoln died of old age, then he is dead, and he didn't die of old age, therefore he's not dead. Well, that doesn't make sense either, because we know that just because you deny the antecedent doesn't deny the consequence. It's a true statement that if he died of old age, then he would be dead, but it not being true that he died of old age doesn't make the consequent true, not true. So we have to keep in mind this only works where the antecedent being affirmed makes the consequent true, denying the consequent makes the antecedent not true. That's called modus ponens and modus tollens. Next is a disjunctive syllogism. A disjunctive syllogism is basically you have a statement, an or statement. Now, in order for an or statement to be true, you can have both of the disjuncts be true or just one of them. Well, if you know later that not P, so you know P is false, but not P is true, then you would know that Q has to be true in order to make this a true statement. If you knew that not Q was true, so you knew that Quentin wasn't there, and it says Paul or Quentin is there, then you know Paul has to be there in order to make the wedge a true statement, going back to our truth tables. And finally, the hypothetical syllogism is basically the idea if it's a true statement that if Paul is here, then Quentin will be here. And if Quentin is here, then Ryan will be here. Then it follows that if Paul is here, then Ryan has to be here. Why? Because anytime P is true, Q will have to be true. Anytime Q is true, R will have to be true. So if P is true, R is going to have to follow because it's going to make Q true, and Q being true is going to make R be true. So this is called a hypothetical syllogism. And basically, it's a little bit more specified. We tend to talk about hypothetical syllogisms as part of deduction that included other types of modus ponens, modus tollens as hypothetical. But this is actually the one that is the most technical version of hypothetical syllogism. And basically, anytime you have a middle term that is the exact same in two of these statements, then you can take the antecedent of the one and the consequent of the other and combine them. Now, we can move on to, if we go back to our, we click the module lessons, we can come down the page and, we can come down the page and there will be, the video, but the first thing you'll notice is there will be one of the first things is you'll have logic problems and answers to logic problems. If you click the logic problems tab, you will get a bunch of logic problems. And so these are all problems that you can do. And there's two sets. There's 25 problems on the first worksheet. And if you click the other one, the answers tab, if you click the answers tab, you will get these same problems, except you'll have the answers on them, and that's to allow you to go back and check your work. So you have the exact same thing here, it's just the answer sheet has this little MP there, meaning modus ponens. Now what happens is the first set of these problems are simply problems that are asking you to figure out which of these rules of inference is being used. There are 5 rules we've learned, and I'm only going to require you to use the first 5 rules. But these first 5 rules are in these. And so you have something like A horseshoe B. A is true, therefore B is true. Well, you can go back to your review sheet, and this is why it's a good thing to print out, and you can, or your reference sheet, and you can look at this, and you can use this sheet on the exam. That's not a problem by any means. I would keep it there. Even when I teach this in the classroom, that would be the only thing I would allow people to have is this sheet. But this is a pretty important sheet to have because it provides you with a pretty good guide to all the different possibilities. But if you look at this, and the first one is, A horseshoe B, A, therefore B, you can look back to this sheet and you can go, well, which one of these has a conditional statement, the antecedent true, then the consequent? Well, it's modus ponens. And so you would come back and you would label that MP. And all you're doing with this is you're basically just trying to figure out which operation is being done. They're all very simple. You just compare these and you look through this sheet to find which one of these 5 rules of inference is being used. This one, A wedge B, not A, therefore B. You're denying one of the disjuncts, so you know the other disjunct is true. And if we go back to this thing, we can go, well, that has a plus sign, that has a horseshoe, that has a horseshoe. Oh, this one has a wedge, and it has a bar P. It has one of the disjuncts denied, making the other disjunct true. So this is an exact example of a disjunctive syllogism. The letters have changed, but it is that same format. And so you would label it as disjunctive syllogism, as you can see on the answer sheet. Now, the only thing to keep in mind as you're doing these is that these statements, these disjunctive syllogism, modus ponens, all these things, don't have to have a single letter as the antecedent and the consequent. These are actually lowercase letters on the sheet that you have. And the reason why they're lowercase is because lowercase letters are not simple statements. They can be compound statements or simple statements. Lowercase letters are used to symbolize any kind of statement. And so a statement like A plus B in parentheses, wedge C plus D in parentheses, is whatever is in that parentheses is all one statement that can be represented by P. And so if you look over and you get a little further along and you have saying like L wedge B plus Z, well, the main operator is the plus, which means either everything to this side of the plus sign can be true or everything to this side can be true. Either of the conjuncts is true. And so it's simple. It's basically taking a simplification of L wedge B. It's taking this whole entire compound conjunct and bringing it down. And so even here where you're doing a modus ponens, the consequent is bar B. Just because N is true doesn't make B true. The consequent is bar B. And so you have to bring the whole consequent down. So don't let that, and so I have some in here that get a little bit more complex, but all these are doing is saying, look, your main operator is horseshoe, your main operator is horseshoe, you have this big statement B wedge L, you have this big one M wedge H, this one M wedge H, bar Z. Well, one thing you can do is you can take this B wedge L and turn it into like a lowercase p, and then this one into a q, and since that's the exact same, that would be a q, and then make that an r. And you have P horseshoe Q, Q horseshoe R, therefore P horseshoe R, and you would realize that is exactly what the book says is a hypothetical syllogism. And so you can then label that as such. So don't let the fact that that these statements are big and complex. The main thing you're looking for is what's the main operator, and don't let all these extra letters and symbols confuse you. That's part of why I do all these problems first, is so that you can kind of learn to recognize all these more complex things that before you get to that point. Now if you get to the bottom of the sheet is basically taking these same things, but instead of doing it as a picture like this and with the line, it's now saying, well, what if we have to do 2 or 3 steps to reach our conclusion? As a matter of fact, as you get more complex, although I won't make it happen in this class, you may have to, in order to reach a conclusion, do 20 or 30 steps. I mean, sometimes these rules of inference and replacement can make these very hairy problems. So what they do is, to save room, instead of rewriting L horseshoe BL line B to reach this conclusion, well, that one's real simple. This is just a modus ponens. What they do is we simply take that same thing and we do it on lines. And so what we do is we say B is our conclusion. This thing over here past the slash is the conclusion. Actually, I'm going to stop here because I'm about out of time for this video, so I'll put another one next to it.